We do have Lane Williams here to present for us today. Lane is an experienced technical instructor with a demonstrated history of training professionals with varied backgrounds and knowledge base. He is highly skilled at creating and engaging interactive student experience during in-person or remote online classes. Certified in a number of disciplines, including CompTIA, Cisco, ISC Squared, CEH, Certified Ethical Hacker, and Wireshark. Thank you, Lane, and I'm gonna kick it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and I do appreciate that nice introduction. I wrote it myself, so that's a good way to start things off. And welcome everyone who has joined this session. And I'm glad you could, because one of the things that continues to fascinate me is how fascinating this topic is. I've been teaching this for well over 25 years now, and I never really grow tired of it. Or if I did, I don't remember when that week or month was. There's always something exciting and new to look at. We'll talk in this session, and we only have an hour, not a lifetime or 25 years, to determine why the foundational information is so important. We'll take a brief look at the basics of the TCP over IP protocol suite. We'll follow that up with the examination of the basics of IP, TCP, and UDP, making some brief notes, a slide or two on each one of those. And then we'll end that by taking a look at a couple of other core protocols or things that make TCP over IP operate successfully. So let's examine our first question, which is, why is this foundational information so important? And we really don't need to go far in that, because when it comes to the idea of connectivity, the ability to enable communication from one point to another in an almost instantaneous fashion, it really is kind of mind-boggling. And if we think about some of the earlier ways that we may have had for communicating across greater distances, this one is really a fascinating way. And what kind of comes to mind is something like a smoke signal. That would give us the ability to communicate across a much wider distance than face-to-face. And of course, quite hopefully, we have done a little bit better than simply smoke signals. Polybius, the Greek inventor, at least in this case, he did a number of other things. Polymath, I guess would be a good term for him. Also established ways of communicating with torches and things of that nature. But this one is the one that we use now, and so that would be a good reason to know that information. It is universally used. When I was coming up the 25 years ago, TCP over IP was merely one of the networking protocols that was available. There were a number of others, very few of which have existed in any terms of popularity. The universally accepted protocol suite for communications is now TCP over IP. And TCP over IP forms the core of the ability for us to manage our communications, our networks. Without that knowledge, we simply cannot have the ability to design new networks, to operate and manage, and to troubleshoot those networks. And the troubleshooting is still an important factor. The networks are much more stable. They're much more functional. They have more to deliver, but we have much greater dependency on them than we ever have, and an ability to solve a problem and solve it in a reasonable way and in a reasonable time frame is key to understanding the core of what is TCP over IP. And I keep saying it like that because, simply put, the idea is that when people begin to look at networking, one of the things that comes up almost right away is the idea of a OSI model in which you have a layered tier of communication protocols. And while it is indeed a model, the actuality of that model is the TCP over IP suite. Ergo, it is a representation of a tiered process in terms of responsibilities and roles. And that is exactly what a protocol is. It's a standardized set of rules in order to allow for the appropriate communications. And that really is all the layering is about, is to have the correct communications at each one of those tiers or layers of communications. Now, when they mention hundreds of protocols, that is absolutely true. But if we begin looking at this in the appropriate way, there are those core protocols such as TCP, UDP, IP, and ICMP that truly form the foundation of the layering process, where there are also application-based protocols such as DNS, SMTP, that's an email protocol, TLS. That one is not quite the same as the other ones. It's a way to provide security for otherwise non-secure protocols such as HTTP. TLS wrapped around HTTP provides HTTPS and provides a secure way for us to communicate. And that one is key also. And of course, there are literally hundreds of other protocols. And I'll give you a brief reference towards the end about if you have any questions on some of those other protocols. But let's take a visual look at all of these things and how they may operate together in terms of a layered approach or layered model. And that is what we're looking at here. What the focus is, and while I do have a few words at the end of the lecture to say about IP version 6, most of this will focus on IP version 4. It is still the dominant protocol. It will continue to be the dominant protocol for at least the near future, as long as you're not in the core of the network or outside the United States. It is also IP version 6 a little more popular. That has much to do with the distribution of the IP addresses. In the beginning, well, we took a lot of good addresses here in the US and didn't leave enough for the rest of the world. And so they were really struggling. IP version 6 does help them. In any case, let's take a look at this layered approach briefly. You'll note on the right-hand side of the page as you face it is a network access layer. That's the bottommost layer, is represented by the physical interface and the technology used to implement that physical interface. Ethernet is a good example of that. Wi-Fi is another. Point-to-point protocol, and once again, various communications. But much like IP has pushed away the other networking protocols, Ethernet and Wi-Fi has pushed aside most of the other protocols found at the network access layer. Above that, we have the internet layer, or as you can plainly see, the IP version 4 layer. And in that, we have a handful of things that work together to provide functionality. One of those, of course, is the protocols that we see closest to the internet layer. That would be something like EIGRP and ARP. Both of those are helper protocols. They assist IP in doing its job. The ARP protocol, address resolution, exists so that there is a correlation between the physical communications and the logical communications. An IP address is a logical address. It's like the address that you might see on a building. It could change, but it's not likely to. Or a better example might be a telephone number. We know that we can certainly change the telephone number of a device by changing the SIM card now, or other methodologies back to landline technologies and so forth. But there is still that physical element, and ARP allows us to combine the two together. There is another protocol within Ethernet that defines a MAC address. So it is the definition of the MAC address, a physical address, and the correlation of that to a logical IP version 4 address. Now, I skipped over EIGRP with a rather lengthy reference to ARP. EIGRP is a routing protocol, and we will take a brief look later at routing protocols, and so we'll eliminate OSPF also, as that is another routing protocol. OSPF is Open Shortest Path First, if you'd like to know your acronyms, and EIGRP is Enhanced Interior Gateway Routing Protocol. A little bit of a mouthful for that one. Along with IP version 4 is ICMP. ICMP is the functional diagnostics for IP. We're most familiar with it with a command like ping, but it provides a number of other resources that let a network identify problems in the network and share that information with its peers, other devices within the network. As a definition for an acronym, Internet Control Messaging Protocol is that resource. And I do believe that the graph on this slide does a nice thing, because ICMP rather is a core function of IP version 4. We just simply cannot function correctly without it. We may control the behavior of ICMP due to security issues, but we must control it, not eliminate it. Now, the next step just above that is known as the transport layer. And the transport layer is the one that allows us to determine really how one machine talks to another machine. What is the protocol? What is the standards? What are the rules for how we do that? If we look at IP version 4, the internet layer, that's how we discover the location of a remote machine. Once we have established that location, we begin moving data back and forth between the pair of machines commonly. And if it is a pair of machines, then the protocol of TCP is perfect. It provides a receiver and a sender functionality that is very nice. It provides the ability, and we'll talk about TCP in an upcoming slide, but just to give us a feel for what it does, it provides a methodology of delivery that ensures delivery of the information. Now, what I cannot do is guarantee that it makes its way through the network, but if the other side doesn't receive it and tells me as much, I can resend it. And that is a key element for what TCP does. It's a way to ensure that information gets from system A to system B. And while Telnet may not be used very often, and if you're familiar with Telnet, you know that that's command line communication between two separate devices. And this is probably the key as to why we created what ultimately became the protocols surrounding TCP over IP. Originally, it was a function of the Department of Defense advanced research projects, and the DoD ARPA would establish Telnet so that two machines could communicate to each other, which simply wasn't being done at the time. 1969 is when that was implemented. FTP, its name tells you exactly what it is. It's an application designed to move one file from one system to another. And then that big change years ago of SMTP, get yourself an email account. SMTP is the functionality of email. There are some other peer protocols with SMTP. POP and IMAP come to mind. They assist communications of email in the internet. HTTP, though, by far and away is the dominant protocol. If we say that TCP over IP is that core protocol, then the ubiquitous nature of HTTP on top of TCP, on top of IP, on top of Ethernet and Wi-Fi really defines most of the functionality of our communications today. Now, one of the key elements in making this work is an ability to find a remote system. And very quickly, they determined that trying to have people memorize numbers, well, like we did with telephone systems, was probably not a good idea. So instead of having to remember numbers, and remember those numbers could theoretically change, that's the IP version 4 address, they created something known as the domain name system. And DNS, domain name system, allows me to query the system, ask for a URI that would be www.google.com in a specified way. And when I ask the question, what is the IP version 4 or IP version 6 address of google.com, DNS will allow me to know what that IP address is and provide reachability. And that is phenomenal. That is probably the key protocol that allows this functionality to communicate in a worldwide fashion. I can manage locally my DNS information and use it to globally communicate. The powerful functionality of TCP provides a lot of overhead. And so it's not the only protocol that we see in use, mainly because not everything is sender to receiver communications. It does contain a level of multiple communications, multi-point establishment, communications where it is not as important that everything sent is received by the other side for a wide variety of reasons. And that established the use of the protocol UDP, which really provides a mechanism for communicating in a very lightweight and simple manner. Examples of protocols that would make use of this are BOOTP or DHCP, dynamic host configuration, in which a system learns its IP address through an automated process instead of having to manually type it in. TFTP is a way to move files that is trivial, and a little hint in this one. In general, if you see the word trivial, that's a reference not to its functionality as much as its protocol stack. If it sits on UDP, it is likely to be called trivial or in some fashion recognized that it is on UDP. And in fact, the next one beside it, SNMP, which is Simple Network Management Protocol, is a function of network management first, and that's pretty clear. But sitting on top of UDP, it is a simple network management protocol. If it were more complex, it would sit on TCP. However, network management needs no additional complexity. That is, after IP version 4, TCP, OSPF, SMP is probably one of the most complex protocols that you could work with, examine, or come in contact with. It's not as used as the other ones are, so most people don't need to know that, but it is, well, just that. Now, RIP, I'm going to put aside once again as just another routing protocol, but it is the oldest of these routing protocols. And its structure and function, as you can see, is a little bit different because, well, it was designed to assist IP, but not to be a core or functional part of it as OSPF or EIGRP would become. So it has its own separated delivery mechanisms and its own structure. Well, we don't get to spend all of the time on that one page as much as I like that. We need to say a few more words about IP, TCP, and UDP, and a couple of things about IP. First and foremost, the idea that we're still looking at version 4 with a few more words to be said about version 6. It is a routable protocol. Not all network protocols are routable. Some are merely to the connected devices within its own physical connection. The protocol of NetBIOS is a good example of that, hence the functionality of NetBIOS over TCP. IP in and of itself is connectionless. There is nothing that indicates that either side has any ongoing relationship to the other side. And it must be for the entire stack, IP, UDP, to create a truly connectionless communications. That has always sounded kind of silly when I hear it because we do have to have some level of connectivity. When they say connectionless, what they're really saying is that I don't demand a long-term call setup and I don't demand responses from the other side in order to know that I'm communicating. In fact, I have no real understanding that we're communicating because it is an unreliable function or best effort. Now, if you place TCP above the IP protocol stack, you get the connection-oriented and reliable communications. If you place UDP above it, the definitions for UDP are both connectionless and unreliable. The final things to see about IP is that it does make use of a 32-bit address. And we'll talk briefly about the addressing and some of the characteristics of that. But the first thing to note that it does take 32 fields in which a field could contain either a 1 or a 0, hence the 32-bit address, and allows us to use that as an idea of the address or reachability of that function. It is still the predominant protocol as we've seen before. And this page doesn't do a great job, I think, of laying out some of the information. And I might need to change this, but briefly, there are 4 bits used in the IP version number, 4 bits for the internet header length, 6 bits are used to designate type of service functionality, 2 bits for the explicit congestion notification, which is rarely used. And while the header has its own size, the overall length of this delivery is referenced in 2 bytes, and that 2 also has its own position in there. The next 3 fields rather, create an ability to fragment a packet. And the functionality of fragmentation is really kind of an old function. And so it still exists in the IP version 4 header, but has been eliminated in the IP version 6 header. Another key element is a time to live. This is a count for how long this packet can kind of run around wild in the as a rogue packet in the network before we remove it. The field that follows that is a protocol field, and that tells us what comes next. What is the next header? And a value of 1 in that would indicate that the next header is ICMP. A value of 6 would tell us that it's TCP, a value of 17 that it's UDP, and so forth. It really tells the system who do you hand this to when you're done with it. The checksum protects the integrity of the information in this header, and the source and destination IP addresses or source and target addresses finish out the remainder of the address information. Now with TCP, that one is connection oriented. And so we get a good chance to at least touch on the terms connection oriented in this aspect, because a connection oriented communications is something that is established before exchanging the data. We set up the rules, the protocol for how the communication will occur. It is full duplex, hence the sender and the receiver, or the source and destination pairing. It is reliable in that it will use sequence and acknowledgement numbers. It will set a value for the total number of bytes sent in a single delivery. It will receive back an acknowledgement of having received those bytes, and then it will send more bytes. And the functionality of that is one of the more complex functions of TCP, but it also does contain the ability for the sender and the receiver to adjust the flow of information. If you can't process as much as the sender is sending, you tell them, hey, don't send me as much. I can't process this amount of data. And if we think about it just briefly, that is brilliant. You could have a very powerful system sitting somewhere in the internet sending information to your phone, and it could easily flood the functionality of your phone by sending massive amounts of information. TCP allows us to manage and control that flow. That is a very nice feature of that. It is, however, a one-to-one delivery, the source and destination. It's not very good for having a distribution model like a video. We probably want to stream that out to multiple parties, and we do with the UDP platform. Port numbers, which I've not said a whole lot about, and in fact, I avoided them on the earlier slide, are used to identify the application. And I'll make some reference to that when we see that same slide show up again. Now, I'm not going to go through the same thing that we did for the IP header, because, well, a lot of this is, well, it begins to dig a little bit deep. But the first 4 of these, I will make note, the source and destination pairing is a key element for everything about communications in the internet. We know who is sending it. We know who is receiving it if we examine one packet between them and look at this information. We also noted that the sequence number and ACK number or acknowledge numbers are key to the correct functionality of the TCP deliveries. Now, UDP, it's almost like you don't have to say anything about it. It's just does the opposite of TCP. It's connectionless. We don't establish any communications. I don't ask, are you there? Can you take the call? I just send it. It's unreliable. It is a best effort, but it is important to note that our networks are much greater standardization in the network structures. They are much more robust, and they very infrequently lose packets, so that even if we call this unreliable and best effort, the likelihood of it getting there is much greater than 99, even 99.9%. Now, when you throw it into the internet, that's a little more iffy, but there are other things that are done to, well, ensure that that information is flowing. It too uses port numbers, and it is by far and away a very simple function. And because it's simple and doesn't contain that flow control, it can be a much faster protocol. And here we do get to see on this slide an overall approach to some looking under the hood, if you will, of what exactly goes on in a delivery of IP communications. It will proceed with an Ethernet header. And if you want to look at this in a layered approach, please feel free to do so, because if I were to bring up Wireshark, the first thing that I would show you is here's the Ethernet header. And that contains 14 bytes of information, and key of which is source and destination pairings. The next 20 bytes commonly is the IP header. Now we can extend that out to be a 60-byte header, but that's kind of rare. The next tier would be where TCP or UDP sat, and we see the UDP header here of just 8 bytes. I'll talk about that in a moment, but the next key element is what's being carried. If the cab of the truck is those first 34, 42 bytes, then the content of the truck is the variable UDP payload or TCP payload, as the case may be. There's also at the very end of this something known as a trailer, and that's the 4-byte element, and that's a frame check sequence. It is a function that checks the integrity of the Ethernet header and ensures that the information that we're looking at is good to go. If there's something wrong with the Ethernet header, then we discard the entire packet, because if something's wrong there, it could be wrong everywhere. And we hope that it wasn't UDP, and we hope that it was TCP, and TCP resends it. As we've noted, the UDP header is much simpler. And here we see 2 bytes of the source port, 2 bytes of the destination port, and then a couple other things, and we're done. The length of this is not the length of the UDP header. That's 8 bytes. It's 8 bytes plus that variable payload. So it lets the system know how long it needs to count in the bits. And then there's a 2-byte checksum to protect the integrity of the header, and in this case, the payload. So that's why it's called UDP payload or TCP payload, because those two work together to provide that protective layer. Now, a much longer list of core protocols, as they note here, some not all. I've already spoken of DNS and its importance, ICMP, and to a degree HTTP. We briefly mentioned some of the others, but the only one I probably did not mention because it hasn't shown up is that one of RTP. And RTP is real-time transfer protocol, and the real-time is hyphenated, hence it's not RTTP, but rather RTP. And I guess that sounds just a little bit better. And RTP is how we do voice over IP delivery. There are 2 protocols used for voice commonly: SIP, Session Initiation Protocol. How we find the elements in that, and the functionality of the delivery, which is the RTP string. So they're kind of separated in that particular model. Now, with the basics of routing, all I really want to talk about are the 3 terms that you see right there. And then we'll mention a couple of other routing protocols, but routing is complex, but routing is absolutely necessary. And one of the key elements of routing is that the telephone company also routed voice communications. One of the key elements for why we move to voice over IP is the ability to keep communications up even in the event of a link failure. And that's what is key for this. Even if where that has the little cloud saying WAN, if that connection fails, we will, through the use of routing protocols, and I just noticed what the name of this page is, and I need to change a little bit of that, but keep that in mind that we have the ability to reroute around failure. I'm going to need to change this. This is not a review of spanning tree. Spanning tree is a very important protocol, but spanning tree is a function of communications within inside a local area network, not the functionality of a wide area network. And for that, I do apologize. Just replace this as a routing protocol. And within routing protocols, each of the devices that we look at here, the LAN on the right-hand side and the LANs on the left-hand side, want to communicate to each other, and they will exchange information amongst these various routers to determine the best or optimal path that will get me from here to there. And how we choose those optimal paths create part of the routing decision process. Of course, if there is a singular route, that's the easiest one to do. If there are more complex routes, then we look at the longest match against those and no routes. This is where ICMP would come in and send you back a message saying that destination is unreachable. You can't get there from here. There are a lot of ways to determine what is the best way to forward the information and what creates the optimal path. One is a simple hop count. How many routers do I have to go through to get there? Or a bandwidth metric. And in the bandwidth metric, what you're looking at there is a speed limit, if you will. Is it going to benefit us better to go through a couple of hops on a slow path, or would it benefit us to go through a much faster way to get from here to there? Could I go 60 or do I have to go 30? Do I have to travel down a 64 kilobit per second link or a 10 megabit per second link or 10 gigabit per second link? There are other protocols for how we can examine this information. Just an arbitrary rule, I can type in and override any of the other things with an administrative goal in mind. Reliability could be a factor, delay, or even load or utilization of the circuit. And they give us an example with this. What's the best way to get from LAN A to LAN B? Well, all of that's going to depend upon the routing protocol. And depending on the routing protocol, as we noted, the bandwidth or the hop count or any of the other metrics, the routing protocols that we see here are routing information protocol, RIP. OSPF would make use of the Norwegian, I believe, computer scientists, Edsger Dijkstra, and to determine the shortest path first. Algorithm, EIGRP, a proprietary protocol from Cisco, and BGP, the routing protocol of the internet. Now, and Border Gateway Protocol is what BGP stands for. Now, here we also are going to take a look at the IP addressing again for just a few minutes. We'll not get caught up into this one, but I did want to note that the listing of the ports for these various services are found here. And so if we're delivering something, we see that we're delivering IP version 4 information. If it's TCP, we pass that up the line to number 6, and that's what we would see in the field. And then we would pass it off to the correct service for HTTP port 80, very common for that. Now here we are going to take a look at IP addressing for just a few minutes. And are some very important things from this that I would like for you to take from this. And that is, if you're going to follow IP addressing and you want to know what all of that means, you're not going to get it here. But I will give you some nice starting points for what you need to be able to do. The first thing is an IP address is broken into two parts. The two parts of the address are the network ID or prefix, and they're known as that because they begin the IP address. So the network that we would be looking at in this case would be 172.16.0.0 because we're not interested in the hosts. The hosts are the locally administered bits, the internal devices would have their own numbering scheme. Now they chose to break this at that dot right there. And that would be, well, 16 bits in because the first byte is 8 bits, and that's where the number 172 comes from. 16 is another 8 bits or a byte. And so they broke that there, but there is no reason for us to break that at that particular point. In modern interpretation of this, I can have a functional delivery of information anywhere along this particular path. I could put my breakpoint right here, or I could put the breakpoint right here, or right here, right here, right here, anywhere that I want. And what is key to the next little bit of this is if we were to say perhaps that I put the breakpoint that everything preceding this, those 28 bits define the network, then there are only 4 bits left to define the host in that space. And that means that I am limited to the exact number of hosts. 2 to the 4th power is 16, and that's important because when we look at 4 bits, I can permutate those into anything within 16 values. But I can't exceed 16 values because, well, I have no more bits. If I needed to examine and make my network grow just a little bit, then I could do this. I could move my little point where the network is defined over one more space right here. And then that much of it would define all the hosts that are available in that network. And we have 5 bits now, and to the 5th power is 32. So I have access to more devices in that singular network. So the reason that we do this is to find out exactly what the appropriate number of devices in the network will be, and to assign an address space to those devices in a reasonable manner in which I am not wasting IP addressing. And the distribution model that they started off with wasted a large number of addresses, hence the need to create all of those differentiations. What makes this a little difficult to follow is that at the heart, this is what an IP address is, that information at the top. In order to make it more accessible to humans, meaning that we might know or learn some of this stuff, we broke it into the 8 bits, and then each of the 8 bits would create its own number. So the maximum number of ones that can be turned on in 8 bits would give me the number 255. So that's the largest number that I could have in an IP address, given that particular constraint. 1 followed by 6 zeros is equal to 192.168.10.100. You can count those up yourself, and you end up with this address. That's what we know it as, 192.168.10.100. But because I can create that net masking functionality anywhere along those lines, it does become much more mathematically problematic, because we want to talk 192.168.10.100 when the actuality of the number is up here. And that changes things considerably. So if you remember 2 things, number 1, that I guess maybe 3 things. Number 1, that an IP address is 32 bits. Number 2, that there is a network portion and a host portion, that the network portion is defined by the net mask and can be any point along those 32 bits. There's some reasons why it won't be in the first 8, and another reason why it won't be in the 31st location. But other than that, you can make use of that, and that you are looking at this, or you should be able to look at it in its binary format. So let's see, that brings us there. Subnetting allows us to take that which was originally network and that which is originally host and move those into the other space. What we are literally doing here, and I threw away my doggone little marker, 1 slide too soon. So let me get me an arrow here. That you steal from the host bits and you give those bits back to the network. When you do, that gives you the ability to create a subnet. The easiest way to look at this is I have myself, I bought an office floor, say. I didn't. And when I go into that floor, I want to have, say, 4 offices, and we'll ignore some of the other complexity of how we get to the offices. But if we treat them as networks, then it's easy for me to take this and divide that functionality into 4 equal areas. I can see where I didn't quite get it equal in that, but if we see that as such, then that gives us the ability to subnet that space, to create a functional element of originally the network. That would be the outer blue lines. The internal is where the hosts reside, an ability to create other lines in this, i.e. subnetwork 1, 2, 3, and 4, would be a function of what subnetting is all about. And it is about how many devices need to be found within that network space. Clear that. We'll keep that up just in case we need it. And finally, the prerequisites for this is why we need to do this to make efficient use of the addressing. We need to follow the binary numbering system and be able to convert from binary to decimal and decimal to binary. Be familiar with IP addresses and classes, subnet masks, the number of bits in each of the tables, and the counting of the bits. And I do think that I chose to draw a square, but the pizza is a very good idea of creating the appropriate number of slices of pizza. I'm hungry. I want a big old slice of pizza, so I get 1/4 of that pizza. My kids are less hungry or more hungry. I don't know. They get 1/2. And so my tiny little daughter only gets 1/8, and my wife gets an eighth. Poor her, I guess. But you can see that that still adds up to a total, but those were the correct sizes for that delivery. As I noted, a few words about IP version 6, and in IP version 6, we increase the address space from an incredible 32 bits, which means there are a potential number of 4.3 billion IP version 4 addresses. We increase that length of the address to 128 bits, which tells us or gives us a number that is 3.4 times 10 to the 38th number of addresses. That's an extraordinarily long number. And we're not going to run out of IP version 6 addresses anytime soon. There are a number of other things that we do get. We get additional elements that define or help us to deal with data integrity. There is the encryption extensions for this. Multicast is a slightly different solution from broadcast or unicast, and there is an enhanced functionality within multicast controls. Quality of service is handled correctly in this, and so forth. And because I do see at least one question, I will take those questions here in just half a moment. And well, I'll take the questions and you can read these jokes on your own. It's about 5 minutes until we end. And I see the question that asks, what are the differences between FTP and SFTP? And by the way, in addition to those two protocols, there is an FTPS. And the key element for the difference between FTP and SFTP is FTP is non-secure. It delivers not only the content, but say your password and your username in clear text. SFTP secures the communication by encapsulating or containing it within a secure shell delivery. Secure shell has replaced Telnet extensively, but there are other protocols that can be tunneled or used within that protocol. And SFTP gives us the ability to secure the FTP protocol via secure shell. The other functionality of that would be FTPS, which secures FTP through the use of TLS that we saw earlier in the same way that you secure HTTPS. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to raise those questions. There we go. If you're dealing with anything related to something as complex as 911, and I haven't looked at 911 ESAP in quite a little while, so I don't know enough about that protocol to give you any suggestions, Patri, except for that is really one of the biggest concerns out there, is making sure that when you are doing voice over IP and you're using that for emergency situations, that you need to deal with that successfully. I apologize, Patri, for not having a better answer than that for that. And if there are no other questions and Jamie is still here, I'll let him conclude the session. And Jamie, we're not hearing you. I can see that you opened your mic.
Elaine, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
There we go. All right, thank you again, Lane. And if we can progress, I think 2 slides actually.
Okay. And I'll
Mhm.
take that question about encapsulation.
Back 1 slide, please, Lane.
All right.
Yes, sir. Again, thank you, Lane, and thank you all for joining. If you do have interest to continue on with this topic and gain further knowledge, then please visit globalknowledge.com and check out our TCP IP networking course. You will find the course outline there. Please take your time to review. If you do feel that the course may be a little bit too advanced, a little bit too much, then we do have our Understanding Networking Fundamentals course that you can look at. And also, if you do feel comfortable with the content, or even after you attend the TCP IP networking course, we do have some follow-on courses as well, such as troubleshooting TCP IP networks with Wireshark. And also you can look at some vendor-specific training as well, such as Cisco and Juniper. And thank you, Lane, for already moving on to the next slide. And to kind of show our appreciation, please take advantage of the promo code for a 25% off on the next course with us. Feel free to do the self-checkout on our website at globalknowledge.com. Or also, if you already have your account rep information, feel free to share this with them and they'll be able to help you out as well. Next slide. And also, if you do have any other questions on top of visiting the website and your account rep, you can also visit our social media pages that we have listed here. Thank you, Lane.
You're welcome.
I think we can wrap it up. 1 more slide, I believe.
I have one outstanding question that I'm going to take before I
Okay.
terminate all of this. So any additional information that you're looking for, find that at live webinars, white papers, courses, special offers. We have a number of things. And the remaining question is one known as encapsulation. I kind of threw that out there without giving you any kind of depth to that. And so if I can have just a minute, I'm going to address that issue. And if you know what it is, don't worry about it. You can go now. We got to get back to lunch and things. But Murray, thank you. Rajiv, thank you. And so forth. Here is all this is. And for this example, we're going to take the protocol of a tunnel, because a tunnel is a very good example of this. We have IPsec that establishes the tunnel. And so in front of this, we have IP address header. And that's the one that's going to deliver us through the internet. But if we were to look deeper into that packet, we would discover back here a second IP header. And when you're delivered across the internet via your IPsec tunnel, they strip off that first part of it and reveal the second part. And so it's a little bit like putting an envelope in another envelope, is really all encapsulation is. So I hope that helps just a little bit in that. Thank you for joining, and I thank everyone. Hope you have a great remainder of your day, wherever that may be.
Thank you again, Lane. Thank you all.